Canada's Western Bank. Bank of BC, and we're all yours.
Bank of British Columbia. We're Canada's Western Bank.
And we're all yours.
If I could show you the air in a room, you'd see that many of those unpleasant, hard-to-get-rid-of odors come from the carpet. But now I found a solution. Love My Carpet Rug and Room Deodorizer. All you do is sprinkle, wait a few moments, and vacuum. That's it. Love My Carpet quickly gobbles up those unwanted odors. By freshening your carpet, you freshen the air in your entire room. Love My Carpet, from the makers of Lysol products.
Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. It didn't take long for the resuscitated Prime Minister Trudeau to present his package. The patriation, bring back the Constitution. The entrenchment of equalization rights from coast to coast. And his mini Bill of People's Rights, language, speech, religion, voting, freedom from arrest, and mobility for working across the country. It has been said by the feds in the secret memos that this unilateral action will probably bring a fight rough in the House of Parliament and in the country very, very rough indeed. You're going to have to suffer through some of this stuff for the next months to see what happens, to see if he can bull it through or whether we not still have a united country. First, what the Prime Minister said in essence last night.
Why have we not succeeded? Why has every attempt in more than half a century led to failure and frustration? It is because we sought perfection in a real and very human world. We assumed that it was possible in a system of diverse governments for all to agree in all respects on everything. In accepting that the only agreement could be unanimous agreement, we took that ideal of unanimity and made it a tyrant. Unanimity gave each First Minister a veto, and that veto was increasingly used to seek the particular good of a particular region or province. So we achieved the good of none. Least of all did we achieve the good of all, the common good. We were led by the dictates of unanimity to bargain freedom against fish, fundamental rights against oil, the independence of our country against long-distance telephone rates. And so, surely, the Canadian people must now find a way of breaking out of 53 years of constitutional paralysis. There is such a way. It is a legal way, though it demands collective determination. Through the one institution in which all Canadians are represented, the Parliament of Canada, Canadians can break the deadlock among their 11 governments.
Following on the last question, do you not expect an upheaval from the provincial governments and the change of this rule at this time?
I can't, quite honestly, I can't see any province or provincial government campaigning so that we leave a constitution in Great Britain. Once again, like with rights in the previous question, I think it was a bargaining point. they hope to get something out of the feds by saying we don't want to patriate. You know, I've heard that some provinces are thinking of adopting resolutions or sending people to London to say they don't want to have the Canadian Constitution in Canada. I think they would look foolish in the eyes of the world and probably in the eyes of the British.
Who knows? The man who will lead the fight in the House of Commons, if it's going to be a very rough fight, although the NDP have taken a kind of wishy-washy position, is going to be Joe Clark, the Prime Minister. Here's what Joe had to say last night.
Now, the last thing that I or any responsible political leader would want is a partisan political fight about our Constitution. But the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition in a parliamentary system occupies a unique position with unique responsibilities. There are times when a government proposes to act against the essential interests of this nation. At such a time, the role of the leader of the opposition is not to submit to the government, but to fight for the larger interests of the country. The Trudeau government has a majority in Parliament. It will not be stopped unless the people of Canada can be aroused to the abuse, to the potential damage to our country that the government now proposes. That is why tonight I appeal to all Canadians, regardless of party allegiance, regardless of region or language or culture, to join with us in the weeks and months ahead to fight this arbitrary measure and to try to achieve a genuine consensus in this country on constitutional renewal and constitutional change. My colleagues and I accept our responsibility to the longer-term interest and the longer-term stability of Canada. We will lead the fight in Parliament, but we need, and for the future of this nation, I ask the people of Canada for your help and your support.
To what extent do you see energy and the Constitution linked together, or do you see one definitely a priority over the other at this point?
They both pose serious problems. The most urgent problem, it seems to me, is the energy problem. We have to have an agreement as soon as possible to stop the leakage of investment money out of this country, to stop the leakage of jobs, to begin to build energy security for the country. So I think the question that must be resolved most urgently is the energy question. And indeed, I think that beginning action on economic matters is also more urgent than concluding action on constitutional matters.
Sir, is it your assessment that you're politically on the right side in this one in appealing to Canadians to join you in this battle? Is it your assessment that that the people of Quebec, for example, would be with you and would join your ranks in this? Or do they want this package or something like it as a means of keeping a commitment that Canadians made to Quebecers?
Frankly, my assessment as of tonight is that the majority of the population of Canada may not be with me in the position that I've taken on this issue. One cannot always choose to seek the immediately popular side when you know that there's a fundamental principle at stake. This will be a long debate, and I believe that as Canadians come to see the threat to the fundamental nature of the nation that is inherent in what is proposed by Mr. Trudeau tonight, that there will be more and more who will come to share the grave reservations that I have.
And in my studio this morning to start the Liberal campaign for support for the unilateral patriation with these other things by Prime Minister Trudeau is Senator Ray Perrault. Not elected, mind you, appointed, but still the only cabinet minister from the far west. Also in the studio today is Bob Ray, the financial critic of the NDP, a man who's sometimes touted as the successor to Broadbent. And I have a third political expert here this morning, a man who's more likely to be, shall we say, more objective, because he's from the Toad and Flail, the Globe and Mail in Toronto. And his name is Jeffrey Simpson. And he knows all about the discipline of power. And I'll be back with Ray Perrault after the break. The week-long constitutional battle between the First Ministers and the Prime Ministers was concentrated entirely, it's a dull phrase, but it's the truth, on the sharing of powers. Last night in his broadcast, Prime Minister Trudeau said that there would be no transfer to the federal government of provincial powers. Is that quite right?
Yeah, so that's essentially correct.
All right, answer this question simply, because the guys who will lead the battle against you are 7 of 10 provincial premiers in all possibility.
Well, I'm not...
What powers have the provinces lost under this proposed Charter of Rights and patriation?
They have lost no power, they've gained power. For example, the patriation of the Constitution. Right now, if there's an amendment to the Constitution to be made, the federal government is the only authority to go to Britain and say, look, we unilaterally want certain changes made to this Constitution. That is at least the theoretical legal power. We're proposing that that Constitution be brought back to Canada, that it cannot be changed without the unanimous consent of the provinces, which is a great democratization process. We say, give us 24 months. We have a formula, Victoria formula, worked out in this, our own province of British Columbia. We think that's the one, unless you come up with something better, and we've offered to accept a national referendum if 80% of them, involving 8 provinces, come up with another formula.
Dry as dust, but I must pick you up on a couple of points.
So
is it not a fact, Senator Perrault, that there has been a solid 100% rule and usage that where you affect the provincial powers, the patriation must be done unanimously? And I can quote you, UIC,
yes,
old age pensions and supplementary benefits. The provinces gave their agreement. You're taking a chance on the legality of going to London with this.
We maintain that the procedure we've outlined is far more democratic, takes into account provincial sensibilities to a much greater extent. Now, beyond that, in the area of human rights, surely, through usage, through law, through our
Let's finish with that
our
first,
advocacy of the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights, we accept that certain human rights should be the heritage of every
Am
Canadian.
I not correct in saying that on every occasion up to now where provincial powers have been involved, there has been unanimity before the amendment was obtained in London? Yes.
To the present time, the rare occasion when we've got to London, there's been agreement with the provinces.
All right,
of
now,
course.
on the
There's
chart, you'll bring it back and you may or may not be legally challenged by somebody or other.
I don't think we'll be legally challenged, and I don't think there's going to be armed conflict either. I think that when people see
Who suggested armed conflict? Was that just a light-hearted remark?
That is a facetious way in making reference to your opening comments in which you said that the secret leaked memorandum, which was a bureaucrat's assessment, one bureaucrat's assessment of what the scenario could be, might result in a fight.
Said very, very rough.
Yeah, that was his personal assessment. I was at Lake Louise and read all of the documents, participated in all of the discussions, and the whole thrust of federal government initiatives has been to get an agreement with the provinces.
Next point. Your amending formula, now correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
says that you'll bring it back.
That's right.
And for the first 2 years, there would have to be unanimity by all of the provinces in any change.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, an extension of freedom, democratization.
And after 2 years, you take it away from the legislatures and you put any change to a national referendum.
No.
What?
We have a formula in our proposed bill.
Well, I misunderstood the Prime Minister last night.
No. We have an amending formula outlined in the bill which would require the support of the western provinces, the Atlantic provinces, the 2 major provinces in the center. It's quite complicated, but really would require a national consensus before we could have any constitutional change or amendment. That's the fact of it. And we have said beyond that, that if the provinces have a better idea, if they have a better formula, then we have a provision whereby they can initiate their own formula and we can put it to the people and have them decide.
Is there no provision for the federal government to go over the heads of the legislatures to a national referendum after 2 years?
Jack, what could
Is there? Is there a provision?
If the provinces request that there be a referendum, we'll put it to the people. Yes, that's
Can
correct.
the federal government in itself initiate a referendum after 2 years on lack of agreement among the provinces?
No, not a unilateral referendum without the cooperation of the provinces. The provinces have to come to us and say, now look, we want a referendum.
Well, I haven't seen the document yet. Are you assuring me that the federal government has not taken the power to go for a national referendum after 2 years of failure to agree down the road?
Now look, here is the process. May I quote it?
Is it an answer?
Well, I've already given my answer. There is a proposal for a referendum if the provinces come up with an alternative idea.
Whose referendum?
It's a referendum at the request of the provinces.
Not at the request of the federal government.
It would be put in place by the federal government.
Federal
as a
government
national referendum. Well, somebody has to run the referendum.
Would the federal government could the federal government put a referendum in on its own?
No, the federal government can't put a referendum in unilaterally without any reference to the provinces and go over the heads of everyone.
Well, we'll have to read this later.
Well, it's a very edifying document, and as I said to Gardy Gardam last night when I discussed it with him, Gardy Gardam, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, I said, you know, it would be very useful to get all of the facts and study all of the documents before any final judgments are made. For example, Jack,
well, just a minute.
The equalization formula, the equalization statement in this Canada Act is the British Columbia wording. We've taken British Columbia's position on the subject of equalization. It's in the bill. Education. People say, oh, is this not an affront to provincial ministers of education, provincial premiers? Not at all. The provincial premiers agreed to this in Quebec in 1978, the idea of providing minority language education where numbers warrant.
Not quite right, Senator Perrault.
Well, why not?
In Montreal in 1978, to which Mr. Trudeau made reference last night, the First Ministers agreed among themselves on a voluntary extension of the use of the French language, not a compulsory one, and I don't happen to be against it, but not a compulsory one in a patriotic constitution.
Well, Jack, this is the degree of the compulsion. May I assure you on this point, this is the degree of the compulsion. This was the Montreal Statement. It is understood due to the exclusive jurisdiction of provincial governments in the field of education, and due also to the wide cultural and democratic differences, that the implementation of the foregoing principle, that is, of minority language education, would be as defined by each province, and that is still the case. In other words,
are you telling me that
still the case?
No, you talk too much sometimes, Senator. Are you telling me that under the entrenchment of the official languages in this country, the provinces could opt in?
They have the prior right to interpret how that shall be enacted. Where numbers warrant...
Is that opt-in?
It's not opt-in.
It's compulsory.
It's a requirement of the provinces to institute a system over which they would have basic control.
In other words,
for example, in the province of British Columbia, we already, and this is to the credit of the province of British Columbia, we already have a system whereby if sufficient number of parents request second language education, then that education is provided. I doubt whether it's going to affect BC's position in any sense.
We're talking nationally, Mr. Perrault. We're not talking parochially or locally or British Columbia. Are you telling me that this language rights in your proposed constitution would give the province the powers not to teach French language?
No, they have a requirement to provide those services, but they interpret how those services are to be provided in their jurisdiction.
Which brings to another very basic point. Hold on, sir, please. We must make a dollar after this break. The Charter of Rights includes the provision of the official language all across the country, where numbers warrant.
Where numbers warrant.
Is that correct?
And you know the greatest protest is going to come from René Lévesque in Quebec. There's been a beleaguered English-speaking minority in the province of Quebec which needs all the protection that can be given them by a concerned federal government. Well, BC is going to be,
no, I know the party line
in practice, unaffected.
Your party line on that is it is the French-speaking people in Quebec who are suffering because they can't send their children to English-speaking schools. But you must admit your government has done nothing specifically to interfere in that up to now.
No, that is not the party line. Our concern is for the minorities, wherever they are, an English minority in the province of Quebec primarily, and in certain provinces, not really in British Columbia to any meaningful extent at all, the situation of the French-speaking minorities.
Next question. When this is in place, as I'm confident you're sure the House of Commons will pass it.
Well, it's going to be a good debate, I'm sure, and it's going to be a useful debate. Mr. Broadbent's description of this proposal last night as a very civilized set of proposals was very heartening to the Liberals, let me tell you.
All right. Now, when we come, and the Premiers won't have the guts enough to challenge you seriously because they know the polls are really against them on repatriating the Constitution.
Well, I don't know, but surely the provinces aren't going to argue against the right of assembly, freedom of conscience, religion, due process of law, and the rest. You know, it's time, I think, to put in writing some of those beliefs that we have held and cherished all these many years in Canada. At one point, over in England, the Knights decided at some point, by golly, we're going to put a Magna Carta in place. We don't trust King John anymore, and they got under the oak tree and they put it in writing.
It's not worth the paper to blow it to hell.
Oh, I think it's a very fundamental document to our freedom.
Question. Under your entrenchment of the French language, minority language rights, forgive me, if a province does not, in the future, supply French in the where the numbers warrant,
Yep.
where is your appeal? To the Supreme Court of Canada?
I would say that the allegedly aggrieved parents might well go to the courts. That would be the recourse because this is a matter of law.
Oh, so we take it away from the politicians, as many democratic-type people fear, and we put it in the hands of judges
Well,
who are going to interpret our political future.
Jack, with all of its shortcomings, I think our judicial system in this country is as good as any in the world. I really believe that.
But
I think you do, basically.
This is a major transfer, however, of interpretation of laws from politicians and legislatures, or even in the federal government, to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Well, these are basic human rights. These are basic human rights.
Simple question. I know they're human rights.
Basic human rights.
But it is a transfer, is it not, from the legislatures, and Blakeney will hate this, to the Supreme Court of Canada?
Yes, there is a final court of resort to the courts of this land. That's correct, and it doesn't frighten me and shouldn't frighten you.
American system.
Listen,
The
Jack,
U.S. system.
Jack, at the present time, they're considering a Charter of Rights in the home of parliamentary freedom over in Great Britain. They're now talking actively in terms of bringing in a Charter of Rights. And they may even model it after the Canadian bill.
That's irrelevant. That's totally
it's
irrelevant.
very relevant. It's very relevant.
Totally and absolutely irrelevant.
Jack, because many people today are saying, look, leave it to the legislatures, leave it to the elected bodies, we'll look after human freedoms. Why do you think there's so many ombudsmen in Canada today? Why do you think we need human rights commissions from coast to coast?
Because civil servants and MPs don't do their
Jack,
jobs.
because every day there are violations of human rights in every province of this country, and we have to start enshrining some of these rights in the Constitution.
The Prime Minister said last night, no transfer to the federal from provincial powers, right?
Yes,
that's what
correct.
he said.
That's correct.
What about
Where do you see a transfer?
What about mobility for work? At the moment, the provinces are able in Newfoundland and other places to restrict employment. Now, I'm not in favor of it, but
I'm not either.
This is to take away from Newfoundland the power to give jobs first to Newfoundlanders. Is that correct?
It is to assure mobility of labor so a premier of the province can't say, look, in this particular area, we're going to keep out British Columbians and we're going to keep Ontarians and Albertans. I talked to an Alberta MLA the other day, and you know what he told me? He said, you know, there are 2,000 people a month coming into Alberta. And he said, they're just trying to get in on the gravy train. He says, we've got to do something about it. Doesn't that frighten you? It frightens me. It frightens me. British Columbia was built because we had mobility of labor from every country in the world and from every province in the country.
Cool it, Senator. I agree with you, but I asked you a simple question. Does this not take away from Peckford and Newfoundland certain powers which he presently has and uses?
Well,
yes or no?
I think certain powers that he thinks he'd like to have, I don't think he should possess them. I think any thinking Canadian supports the idea that there should be mobility of labor in a state which has a common set of customs and usages and is developing as a family.
Yeah, I know. I'm merely trying to establish some facts.
I don't think it's a transfer of power from Peckford at all.
He has the power at the moment. Now, what about PEI's land?
No, it's been challenged. This idea is being challenged.
Trudeau said last night that it's the right for a Canadian to be free to move to buy a home.
Yeah.
Does that hit at Saskatchewan's discriminatory laws which prevents non-residents from buying farmland in Saskatchewan?
Yes, I would say to a certain extent that's correct.
So head-on battle with Blakeney on that?
I don't know if it's a head-on battle. I think Mr. Blakeney, perhaps Mr. Blakeney can talk to Mr. Broadbent, and Mr. Broadbent can convince Mr. Blakeney that this is a civilized set of proposals. His national leader, obviously, finds merit in the proposal, and I hope he's going to be able to persuade Blakeney. What do we have? If we don't start adopting a set of human rights in this country, we're going to have a collection of Balkan states, every man for himself. I am all right, Jack. You know.
Well, I personally am just a little afraid of the judges.
Well,
I mean, do I trust a politician more than I trust a judge? Answer that question, Webster.
Well,
do you trust a politician more than you trust a judge?
Do you have more faith in Premier...
No comment.
Do you have more faith in Premier Bennett of British Columbia than you would in the BC Supreme Court, or Dave Barrett in the BC Supreme Court, or Ray Perrault, or anyone else? I think that
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it would tend to incriminate
me think about
whatever way I gave my opinion.
But Jack, think about it. Think about it. We're getting down to something very fundamental here.
Sure are.
We're getting down to
Charter of Rights.
Are you happy with the fact they had a padlock law in Quebec and the restrictions on certain religious freedoms in Quebec? Are you happy with some of the things that happened to certain racial minorities in the history of this country?
Answer your own question, Senator Perrault, after the break. Must try and keep it simple, Senator Perrault, for me, if not for you.
Mobility of labor.
Will the new Constitution on the freedom of movement of people supersede any provincial laws now extant giving discriminatory powers to residents of provinces?
No, it won't. And it's Section 95 of
What do you mean, no, it won't?
Section 95 of the BNA Act. In each province, the legislature may make laws in relation to agriculture in the province and to immigration into the province. You're right in the first instance. And it is hereby declared that the Parliament of Canada may from time to time make laws in relation to agriculture in all or any of the provinces and to immigration into all of the provinces. And any law of the legislature relative to these matters shall have effect in and for the province as long and as far only as it is not repugnant to any act of the Parliament of Canada. There's a clear federal right to act in this area.
Your answer to my question is not no, it's yes. My answer to the question is, will this new deal, if you call it that, wipe out discriminatory laws by provinces on mobility? And the answer is yes.
Yes, and it's done legally by us.
Will this legal rights in your new bill, which I've just seen for the first time, and he didn't mention it last night, will this wipe out something which is still on the books called the War Measures Act?
In my view, this will prevent a recurrence of incidents which caused so much controversy at the time of the implementation of the War Measures Act. Yes.
You think this will wipe out the War Measures Act?
Well, taking it off the statute books, we've already moved to bring in a countermeasure, a replacement measure for the War Measures Act. But this provides for the
we still have the War Measures Act on the books at this moment.
This will provide. I believe it's still on the books, but if it hasn't been taken off the books, we are preparing alternative legislation.
All right, let's do it very calmly.
But the human rights that are listed in this document are going to be so fundamental that we're going to have the right to a fair trial, the right to be, for example...
We don't have it now?
Well, we have it now, but we're enshrining it in a constitution so there is no doubt about the position of any Canadian, regardless of racial descent. For example, enshrined in here will the right to have interpretation if you can't speak French or English. If you're an Inuit from northern Canada, there has been a spotty application of this right in Canadian history.
I'm not arguing against motherhood. I just want to get it clear. Patriation will be done by July the 1st next year, come hell or high water. Was that not his deadline?
He hopes that that's going to be the deadline, but I don't think that's an arbitrary deadline. I personally would like to see somebody go over at Christmas time to the Queen with a resolution from Parliament of Canada with respect to the constitutional package. We may not be able to meet the deadline. The opposition of certain rights to debate.
Is the Crown still in the new Constitution?
Oh, of course.
It is.
Of course.
So no matter what it is, it's not a U.S.-type Constitution.
No. We have a great system, the parliamentary system, and great reverence for Her Majesty.
But you're taking some away from the Parliament now and going to put it in the hands of the Supreme Court of Canada.
Well...
is that not right?
I think that's oversimplifying. I think that we're going to enshrine certain rights by making sure that there's the full force and power of the courts behind certain rights.
One of my constitutional expert friends was pointing out just a little nitty thing last night. You put freedom of religion in the Constitution and you can't close stores on Sundays. Well, that's what the U.S. Supreme Court decided.
There may be some interpretations which are going to flow from the courts as a result of the passage of this bill, yes.
You're giving up some of your powers. Well, you're a senator. You're not an active politician.
I'm as active as any politician in British Columbia, let me tell you.
What powers are you actually giving up to the Supreme Court of Canada? That's what I'd like to know. Interpretation of the language rights?
You're enshrining certain and entrenching certain basic human rights, and in the element the courts will be in a position to interpret whether or not there have been violation of those rights. We can still appeal to legislatures for remedial action in certain matters. This does not truncate or take away from the power of the legislature in any real sense.
Yes, it does.
Well, I don't agree with you. In what sense?
You told me it did.
In what sense?
You said, for instance, that the Supreme Court of Canada will probably decide if an aggrieved parent complains about the quantity of French education or minority language education in any province.
That doesn't mean to say that human rights commissions are not going to continue to operate, an ombudsman, and the legislatures aren't going to have active MLAs fighting for human rights. It's only in the ultimate, when it's a really fundamental matter, that someone may wish to appeal to the courts. This doesn't remove the whole apparatus.
Just to sum up, patriation will be done. You feel it's legal and proper.
And all the parties are going to support it, I'm sure.
Pardon?
I'm sure that Clark will support that probably in the ultimate.
That's not what he said yesterday.
He said he thought it was generally a good idea, but I'm sure that NDPers and Conservatives and Liberals and any other party people across the country know that it's time to bring that Constitution back after 113 years. We've talked about it long enough.
Equalization, there's not much argument.
No argument. It's the BC formula. The words were developed by the province of British Columbia.
The Charter of Rights faces fairly solid opposition from 7 of 10 premiers.
Yeah, but the interesting thing...
Politically speaking.
If
they dare challenge it.
Politically speaking, but Jack, they have all agreed that they support these principles. They've all agreed they want these language and education rights. They've all agreed to this at one time or another. So the Prime Minister is taking leadership. He's saying, oh, listen, we've talked about this for 57 years, starting in the 1920s. Let's get going and get the job done.
He says, the hell with you. The back of my hand will do it this way.
That's the last thing he's doing.
One last question again. Give you time to reconsider your answer, because we don't know it yet. Is there any provision in there whereby the federal government can go direct to the nation on a referendum to change the Constitution after they can't get agreement with the provinces?
No. My view in reading this bill, analyzing this bill, is no. And I've been at many and all of the committee meetings with respect to the development of this bill. And I refer you, Jack, and I've provided you with a copy of the bill today. Look at pages 12, 13, and 14. And as I said at the outset, it requires unanimity for a 24-month period. There is a Victoria formula which will come into effect if there are no objections from the provinces. If there are objections, it takes 80% of the population of this country in 8 provinces to say, look, we want a referendum. We want a different formula. We
80% including Ontario and Quebec.
Well, it's all spelled out here in detail. What we are looking for is a consensus from coast to coast, and then there are other provisions with respect to the holding of a referendum on the various subjects of amendment, which are going to be the subject of a great deal of study by the opposition in the House of Commons in the next few weeks and months. I hope we can have a big national dialogue in this subject with more light and less heat.
Well, I'm trying to be hot with you this morning. All I'm doing is trying to get a few basics clear in my rather...
And good that you do it.
Pygmy little mind. My thanks to Senator Ray Perrault. Next, we're going to talk to Bob Ray, NDP fellow, finance critic, from somewhere in Toronto or Ontario, after the break. Bob Ray is the NDP MP for Broadview Greenwood in Ontario. It's in Toronto, actually, isn't it?
East end of Toronto.
And he made his name as the man who brought down Joe Clark's government. Is that not correct? Almost single-handedly?
Well, I had a few other people there helping me, about 140 others, I think.
Yeah, but tell me what you did that day that caused the crisis. Sub-amendment to the budget, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. We thought the Tory budget was lousy, and we're about to face another Tory budget brought in by the Liberals.
So you're the guy who caused all this trouble now. If you had been decent enough to go away for your Christmas holidays...
That's right.
Joe Clark could have withdrawn the budget.
Did you talk to him about that?
No.
No.
Did you?
No.
Could he have done?
Oh, I think if there'd been some discussions months before about a number of things, I think Ed Broadbent talked to Clark and talked about Petrocan and a couple of other things. I think that the attitude in the House would have been very different. But
and if he'd spoken effectively to 4 or 5 social creditists?
Yeah, that might have worked. But it was a little late by that point.
Well, we're really indulging in nostalgia, but the point I'm making is that we could have avoided all this foo-for-all that we're going to have on the Constitution. For a little while longer.
But you never know what would have happened. I think that the problem with the Tory government was that they didn't have enough people. There, they didn't have a majority, and Mr. Clark tried to govern as if he did have a majority, and that's what I think brought him down.
You haven't seen or read much about it yet, but what do you feel about Trudeau's plan, patriation, equalization, and a mini Charter of Rights?
Well, the view, I think, of our party, and I haven't had a chance to really reflect on it very much, as you'll appreciate, not being a senator. I haven't seen the bill. Only being a member of Parliament, I haven't seen the actual stuff that's been produced, but we take the view, we have been on record for a long time as being in favor of a Bill of Rights. We have been in favor for a long time of the principle of equalization, which is fundamental to a federal system. And I think it's time, I think most Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, I think feel that it's time we had our Constitution home and had a way of amending it here at home. Having said that, I'm glad that one of the things that Mr. Trudeau did, and I think this is essential for people to understand, is that he has in fact presented a resolution which is a reference to a committee of a resolution. And one of the things that signals to me is, I hope I'm right. The Liberals are not great listeners. They have a lot to learn in that regard. But one of the things I hope will happen...
You have to learn when you're the boss.
Well, sometimes you're not the boss forever. Times can change. Is that they will be prepared to listen, because as Mr. Broadbent said last night, and as I think is evident from your discussion this morning with the Senator from British Columbia, there are things that are left out of it, and there are things that are not, that are in it, that cause problems and that will cause problems. And
some of them are quite embarrassing to the NDP.
I don't think there's anything that's embarrassing to the NDP.
Well, I had Roy Romanow on the other day arguing in favor of discrimination in land owning and telling me that it didn't matter whether it was a rich lawyer from Toronto or an American financier, no non-residents were going to own any farming land in Saskatchewan.
Well, if a province is concerned, and I think many provinces have to be concerned about patterns of ownership in farmland, concentrations of ownership, foreign corporations and others taking over, the development of big business and the destruction of the family farm. It's not only Saskatchewan that's worried about that. British Columbia is worried about that. Ontario is worried about that. Prince Edward Island has restrictions in terms of...
You've got to be a resident to own, I think it's 10 acres or something.
There are...
Waterfront.
There are, I think, aspects of provincial life, including some patterns of ownership and so on, that are very fundamental to the life of a community. And what I think we have to look at, and I haven't had a chance to look at the bill, and the committee will have to look at the bill, but one of the things we're going to have to look at very, very hard is how provincial patterns can deal with the rights which are being entrenched. Now, one of the things that Mr. Trudeau didn't do, which we were afraid that he was going to do, was to say, you know, that the notion of a centralized economy would be part and parcel, that total freedom of capital, total freedom of movement of all goods and services across the country would be in the Constitution. I think that would be a terrible thing. It would mean that no government, federal or provincial or local, could have any control in protecting the rights, the security rights, which are in many ways just as important as mobility rights of the average Canadian. I mean, it's all very well to say to the, you know, you can...
They don't understand it.
You can move up. You can move from Cape Breton to Alberta, and that right will be enshrined in law. I think it's just as important to say you have certain rights, certain security rights when you're living in Cape Breton.
I don't understand it at all. See, I immediately think of Bill Bennett, who said to...
Well, I don't always think immediately of Bill Bennett.
Well, I do, because we live here.
No, I understand.
And we have the two nightmares, Bennett or Barrett, right? And
one's a dream and one's a nightmare.
One's a dream and one's a nightmare. I'll agree. You can put your own tags on whichever one. But I always remember Bill Bennett calling him Big Julie. You know Big Julie.
Big Julie.
Sinclair.
Yes.
CPR.
Yeah.
Saying, get your hands off Mac and Blow.
Yeah.
Should he be allowed to do that?
I
Mac and Blow being very big Western lumber.
No, I know who Mac and Blow are.
Good.
We're not all that ignorant in Central Canada. We do read the papers and so on. And I have a lot of.
May I say
I have a lot
papers?
of I have a lot of NDP colleagues who inform me about matters in the West.
No, but is that parallel to your point about Cape Breton? The provincial premier must have the right to
I think we have to recognize the fact that provincial economies are real things. They're not just. We don't have a totally centralized economic system, and that's I think what Mr. Broadbent is saying about resources. To get to the fundamental point about what's left out of this thing, it's. The point that Mr. Broadbent was making, I think, is that if the provinces are going to have some security, and it's not just the western provinces, it's Newfoundland, it's Nova Scotia, it's right across the country. If they're going to have some security in this system, which we're moving towards, and some sense of confidence as we move towards a new constitution, I think the provinces have to feel, and the people in the provinces have to feel, that their economic base is secure, and that their ability to depend on a certain source of revenue and a certain
Ownership of resources.
Owning resources is very fundamental.
But interprovincial trade must surely be free.
Sure. There's no question about that. That's not affected by... If you say the ownership of resources is there, that doesn't mean that interprovincial trade is still in the hands of the federal government. That's not being changed.
Surely the other thing that has been avoided in this charter, and wouldn't be in the charter anyway, or this constitutional change, is the budget. What's going to happen in the budget? You're the expert critic. Do you anticipate there's going to be an energy tax which is going to slice seriously at BC's revenues and nibble away at some of Alberta's excess billions?
Well, I think a natural gas export tax, which I think is what you're referring to, is a very bad idea at the present time for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, we're having trouble selling. The markets for the gas are drying up. Second of all, we've argued in our party that the export of natural gas is not something that we should encourage. We argued very strongly against the building of the pipeline. I don't see how we as a party can now say, well, we want you to tax this export, which we're very concerned about. When it's crazy. And also, there is ample room for taxation of the companies themselves without having to go to the export tax. The difference being that the federal government will take from the provinces with an export tax, and the federal government could take from the companies with a windfall profits tax.
Soak the rich. Rich corporate structures. Hit them at the tax end.
They have made one hell of a lot of money in the last 2 or 3 years with the oil prices going up. There's no justification for it.
Webster and Bob Ray, NDP, after the break. Bob Ray, finance critic for the NDP in the House of Commons. Do you expect the federal government, the Liberals, really to hammer us on our personal taxes in the budget this fall?
I'm afraid about that. They've showed a lot of signs that they don't understand the fact that when you've got nearly 1 million unemployed, well, over 1 million unemployed now, and the economy in real serious recession, the worst recession since 1954, it's a crazy time to take money out of people's pockets and tell them they can't spend.
Not here, it isn't.
Well, take the country as a whole. You said to Senator Perrault you didn't want to be parochial. Let's look at the national economy. We're in bad shape.
Oshawa, dreadful shape.
No, not just Oshawa.
Newfoundland.
Manitoba. Many parts of Canada are
Okay,
in bad
what do you
shape.
expect them to... Where do you expect us to be hit by... Who is the finance minister now?
McKechnie?
McKechnie, that's right.
Yeah, I
The
think
quiet
it's McKechnie.
man.
The quiet
man.
The invisible man with the invisible hand.
Right. Okay, what's he going to do? Just have a good guess at it.
I think there's going to be some increases in taxes, both personal and corporate. I think that basically, though, he's going to try and deal with the energy tax as the main source of his revenue, which I find very funny because it really means that his budget is going to be exactly like the one that he and Mr. Trudeau and the other Liberals were so determined to defeat last December.
Will they de-index our personal allowances?
They might fiddle around with it. I don't think they'll de-index the whole thing. I would be very surprised if they did that. That would be very crazy of them to do that.
With all these incredible deficits we hear about from time to time, are we in a bad state financially? Canadian dollar 85, 84 some cents?
The basic problems of the economy are very serious. You know, we import so many more finished manufactured goods than we export, and we're still reliant very, very much on our export of resources. And every time Liberals and Tories say, or Socreds say, let's solve this problem, what do they suggest? They suggest another massive sell-off of resources, either coal or natural gas or whatever, at relatively cheap prices.
Surely it doesn't matter as long as we own the whole place. We can always do what we wish with the foreign owners in due course.
Yeah, but it's not as easy as that because, you know, there's a difference between coal and bananas. Bananas are renewable, so we're not a banana republic, but coal's not renewable. And if you sell coal cheap now, at heavily subsidized, you know, with federal, provincial subsidies, whatever, to pay for all the railways and everything.
You have the kind of classic NDP view that you leave the resources in the ground until they can be mined or exported or treated to our satisfaction.
If that's the classic NDP view, that's my view, but I think it's I also think it's a very intelligent view. It's good husbandry, an old Scottish term. It's a very wise way of handling your resources. It's a smart thing to do. It makes more sense than selling it off cheap, early.
The night of the election, I was briefly on CTV nationally. The election, of course, had been decided by the time we came up on the screen in British Columbia.
They should start out here and then go east.
No, somebody came up with a very good idea to change the voting times so that all the polls close at the same time across the country. I don't know who it was, but it's a good
Probably
idea.
the NDP.
No, it wasn't the NDP. Who was it? Who remembers? Then they remember whose idea that was. In any case, I predicted somewhat voraciously that night, and tell me if I was a complete fool, that Clark would be dumped before the next election.
Mr. Clark said last night that the leader of the opposition was in a unique position. I think he is in a unique position. I think that he, particularly after the position he took last night, I think he's dead in the water.
Because he said, I know I'm not popular and I'm going to fight this?
No, because I think he has taken a position which, in my view, does not respond to the circumstance, to the requirements of history. It's a very small-minded view at a time when I think people expect a little more from the national leaders.
So by and large, with a few quibbles...
No, it's a major quibble. The question of resources is not a small quibble.
Yours is a major quibble.
Yeah.
If he had put the ownership of resources in the constitutional change last night, I thought it was already there, but then again, I'm pretty
I think the whole thing depends to what extent Mr. Trudeau decides and the Liberals decide that they're going to try and build a national consensus by referring this thing to the House, by having a committee, by having a decent debate, or whether they're just going to say this is our personal package, which we're not going to accept any amendments to or changes to, and we're going to ram it through. I think if they take that attitude, they're making a big mistake.
Well, they wouldn't apply closure because you'd all want to go home for Christmas anyway.
Well, we'd be prepared to debate this thing as long as they want to.
Through Christmas?
Oh, sure.
It seems, I don't like the way he's rushing it through by July the 1st, or am I being petty-minded?
No, I don't. I think it's important to get the process started. I think it's important also to for that man and that government to concentrate just as much on the economy and on the question of energy as they're concentrating.
Is it going to be a very, very rough fight? Will the provincial premiers get in there with both feet?
I think it depends on their attitude to the amendments and how generous they're prepared to be in the committee.
Blakeney won't like this. Sterling Lyon won't like it. Bennett won't like it. Pickford doesn't like it.
But that's not the question. They may not be happy with it, but whether or not people are prepared to ultimately accept it, I think depends on whether or not the Liberals are prepared to move a little and in fact make some major concessions in the area of resources.
Well, I'm sorry to hear things are so bad in the East. They're not that bad here.
You should come and visit us sometime.
It's a long way. It's a big country, although we're all Canadians first.
That's right, that's right.
My thanks to Bob Ray,
Thank you,
NDP MP. Next I'm going to talk to a political journalist who's sick and tired of politics this morning before we're finished. Jeffrey Simpson on the discipline of power after the break. Jeffrey Simpson's from the Toronto Globe and Mail. Can't remember who owns the Globe and Mail now. Who owns the Globe and Mail?
Thompson.
Oh, you're the Thompson flagship.
That's what we'd like to think.
Yeah, and you're going to stay. The Globe and Mail will stay, won't it? That's the kind of Thompson's Times of London, isn't it?
That's what Mr. Thompson says, and we all hope that he lives up to his words.
Now, I know we're not here to not talk newspapers, but will it become a national newspaper one day with instant...
Well, as a matter of fact, next month the paper's going to be sent by satellite from Toronto to Montreal and Calgary and printed in those two cities, and therefore in British Columbia and in Alberta the distribution will be much better. We hope to about triple our distribution in Western Canada in the next year.
The only thing you won't do is triple your staff in the West.
We already have added a Calgary bureau, and we've already added an Edmonton bureau, and we already have a Vancouver bureau, and we're going to set up a Winnipeg bureau either in October or November.
Oh, maybe some jobs for the people put out of work by the previous mergers and cut-downs.
We've hired somebody from the Winnipeg Tribune. We've hired somebody from the Ottawa Journal.
Not what we're here to talk about. You were happily and unhappily in the studio when I was talking both to Ray and to Senator Perrault. You have some idea of what happened last night. What do you think? Before we talk about your book, what do you think? In fact, it's part of your book.
I think it's...
You can assess Trudeau's attitude last night and Trudeau's plan. Give me, for goodness sake, a non-political assessment from a newspaper man, an author.
I think that Trudeau has had this in his mind for a long, long time. In fact, interestingly enough, in 1979, right at the end of the campaign, when he knew he was going to lose, he gave a couple of speeches for history in which he talked about what he would do on the Constitution. He knew he wasn't going to have that chance, or at least he thought at that point he'd never have that chance. And he's done it. He said, this is what we're going to do on the amending formula, this is what we're going to do on patriation. There's very, very little in what he said last night that he didn't say at the end of the 1979 campain. So he's had a long-standing fixation with this, and he's had the strategy, is what I mean to say. He's had the strategy in his mind for a long time.
You deal in years, I deal in time. When he was defeated?
Yes.
Before he was defeated or after he was defeated?
In the last week of the defeated campaign, 1979. The interesting aspect of last night for me was the position that the Conservatives took. You know, in this book, which we'll get to in a second, there's a long chapter on the way in which Mr. Clark came into power talking about community of communities.
Right.
And how he hoped that by showing goodwill to his Conservative Premier friends and by making some concessions on Lotto Canada and the offshore, he could secure a much more agreeable attitude with the Premiers. Well, of course, he got sandbagged by Mr. Lougheed. He was cut up badly by Mr. Davis in Ontario. His credibility was ruined in Ontario, and he didn't get anything for it in Western Canada, appreciably. Now, with the community of communities idea that served him so badly when he was Prime Minister, he apparently, judging by the clip that you showed at the beginning of the show, is fallen back into the same trap of saying, I'm going to embrace very lustily these provincial premiers and hope that I can somehow save my political skin dealing with these premiers. Well, he obviously didn't learn from when he was Prime Minister.
They will turn around and cut his throat again for their own advantage.
What I mean to say is that when you're a national leader, it seems to me that the history of the country demonstrates that you don't get very much political credit siding with provincialist views of how the country is organized and how it should operate. That's fine to say if you're a provincial premier of whatever stripe, but when you're a national leader, if you're seen to be someone who will weaken the national interest in order to get along with the provinces, you don't get very much credit for it. And the Tory party, Jack, going back, well back into this century, for a whole variety of reasons, has often taken provincial views and said, this is the way we have to conduct affairs in Ottawa, and they haven't gotten very much credit for it.
Is this where Trudeau, last night particularly, shows his intellectual superiority?
I think he shows a better understanding of the country, and I'm not saying this as a liberal or as a partisan of Trudeau. I think there is a thread in this country that runs back.
You're not a liberal.
Not at all.
You're a nothing, I presume.
That's up to you, Jack. At the end of the interview, you can tell the viewers whether I'm a nothing or not. Well, what I mean to say is that from the beginning of Canada, there's been a thread that this country is more than the sum of its parts, to put it colloquially. MacDonald had it and so on. And Trudeau is the representative of that at the moment. Like him or love him, hate him or detest him, he is in fact the representative of that. And I think he's got the other parties over a barrel. And I think he's got the premiers over a barrel too.
In other words, he can go ahead with this, do his campaigns across the country, and he's the only guy who says, I want to make and keep this a unified nation.
He can portray his opponents as being quarreling provincialists who do not have a vision of the whole country.
Difficult to think
because, you know, excuse me, Jack, the debate will not revolve around what that parliamentary committee decides in terms of Clause A or Clause B.
No.
It will be a symbolic debate, it will be an emotional debate, it'll go to people's hearts, and Trudeau's got the upper hand, I think.
It's difficult to take a man like Blakeney and regard him as an enemy of one nation.
No, I think Mr. Blakeney's probably one of the 2 or 3 most responsible premiers, if not the most responsible premier. He is, with possibly one other exception in my view, the only premier who says, I have a responsibility to represent my province, but at the same time I must remember that my province is a small province and vulnerable, and I must take a national vision.
Take Blakeney and Lyon and take this mini Charter of Rights. It's not that big a charter, except for the language, which where numbers warrant, back in the hands of the courts.
Sure.
Mobility, freedom of speech, religion, non-discrimination. Who can argue against it?
Well, that's my point. That's my point. You see, Trudeau,
I wasn't going to give that to Perrault this morning, mind you. You know.
Thank you for giving me the soft questions. No, but I think that's the point, that Trudeau will be able, in symbolic terms, to say to Canadians, how can you basically be against this? What's going to happen in the debate, I think, Jack, is that the premiers are going to come in and load into the debate all kinds of regional grievances. They're going to try and say, no deal unless we get the offshore. No deal unless we get clarification of resources. No deal unless we get communications. We shouldn't proceed with this until all these other matters are settled. And Trudeau's going to say, look at this on its own merits. And tell me whether you agree with it or not.
He had one great phrase last night. What was it he said? I'll find it from the transcript. Got to go to the newspapers for this.
Well, as always.
Fundamental rights against oil. The independence of our country against long-distance telephone rates. Would he write that himself?
I doubt it. I doubt it.
I mean, he goes
well, the way Trudeau does his speeches is that he gets a number of drafts done, and they're vetted by his political advisors, and then he goes over them reasonably carefully himself. He was obviously there trying to make a local pitch.
Man, you can't make a speech from a script. He said the things, but he didn't make a speech last night. He was usually the kind of glassy-eyed.
I'm sorry I didn't see him because I was flying out here to do your show.
Discipline of Power. Jeffrey Simpson. Book. Political Observer. Man About Town. Raconteur. Bon vivant.
Guest on the Webster show.
After the break. The Discipline of Power by Jeffrey Simpson talks about the 9 turbulent months in Canadian politics when the Tories got thrown out and the Liberals waltzed back in. You dissect the whole business, don't you?
Yes, at excruciating length, but with some flair.
Yeah, well, give me some of the flair. Who won the election for the Liberals, apart from you say...
Joe Clark.
I'll be more specific.
Well, I am. The election was over before it began because the Liberals, from their private polls, understood, and this is one of the reasons why the government fell in December, that the Conservatives, for a whole variety of reasons, had gotten themselves in serious political trouble. Unfortunately, the Conservatives, again for a variety of reasons, didn't understand that they were in trouble, and when they were defeated, were profoundly convinced they were going to win the election, and a majority election to boot. So it was Joe Clark who, in fact, won the election for the Liberals, and when they started the campaign, the Liberals knew that all they had to do was avoid making a serious mistake, and they would be the government of Canada again. And that's why they low-bridged Mr. Trudeau and ran this sort of cynical campaign that they did.
Have they not taken longer to prepare their first budget than Joe Clark did?
Yes, but the difference was that the mentality in Ottawa was entirely removed from what it is now. The Tories were in a minority position, and when they'd been in opposition for all those many years, they kept saying that the country was going to hell in a handbasket. Finally, the country had voted for them. Fundamental change. Opposition party is judged by its promises. It has no track record. So as soon as they came into office, people started asking, what about your promises? The Liberals come into office. They have a long track record. People don't ask about their promises anymore. They are perceived as being the natural governing party of the country.
If Joe had gone in and called the House of Commons right away within a month or something and presented a few goodies, he might have made it.
Well, he would have enhanced his early reputation and probably avoided the plummeting in his political fortunes that took place in the summer or the fall. But, you know, the basic problem they had is...
Mind you do talk as an Easterner, if you don't mind me pointing it out.
Well, you talk as a Westerner.
No, but you're talking as an Easterner, you see. You say the great Liberal victory, the great Liberal that, you know, the low-level campaign.
Yeah.
He sure as hell got clobbered west of the Lakehead.
Yeah, and I make the
I mean, we've got Senator Perrault here, speaking for the Cabinet.
I make the point in the book that I'm rather sad, not as a conservative, but as a sort of observer of the system with the way the election turned out, just because, among other reasons, it's healthy in a federal system and in a parliamentary system to have an alternance of the parties in power. In the case of the federal system, people in Western Canada have been voting in a majority fashion for the Conservatives ever since Diefenbaker. It helps in a federal system for a region to believe that if their guys aren't in this time, they'll be in next time. In Western Canada, they've been voting consistently for the Conservatives for 20 years, and they haven't had their boys in power except for that 7-month period. What that does, Jack, is that it makes people, I think, in Western Canada more inclined to say, well, we can't count on Ottawa, our party in Ottawa, to fight our battles for us. We just have people in opposition down there. We'll turn to our provincial governments and let them fight our battles for us.
That's really what's happening in the country today.
I think so.
And the other,
you take the province of Quebec. I mean, I'll just turn that argument on side. Quebec is such a liberal fortress now. If you're a Quebecer and you don't happen to agree with the federal Liberals, where do you go if you want someone to express your discontent? Do you go to the one lone Tory in Ottawa? No, you go to your provincial government. You say, you fight our battles for us. Now, that's a tendency in Quebec anyway, but the preponderance of the Liberals in Quebec augments that bilateral tension.
On the other side, and in the West, the alienated, of whom there are still many, don't kid yourself,
and growing,
alienated look and say Quebec, the liberal bastion. These people in Ottawa don't really govern the country. They govern Quebec, with a few hangers-on in Ontario.
Because of the nature of the system and because we've had elections such as the last two, that feeling is allowed to grow. Because people in Western Canada say, all right, the Liberals have a large strength in Quebec. They've been in power for 10 years. Now our party, if you like, I mean, obviously people in the West vote for all three parties, but in a majority way the Conservatives, they weren't given a chance. Or they were given a chance and they blew it, as the case may be.
Question.
Sir.
Not quite related to your book, but you know enough. Was Keith Davey the genius or Coots? That funny little man Coots?
Both. The funny little man
And
Coots.
the Senator Keith Davey.
And Senator Keith Davey.
They're the genii of the Liberal Party.
I write a fair bit about them in that book because I think it's extremely important to talk about the individuals who shape the strategy for the parties. I mean, MPs play an indispensable role, prime ministers and leaders and so on, but when you're in a partisan period such as this, the men behind the leaders, if you like, are absolutely crucial.
Is it not a fact that the House of Commons nowadays, in today's political life, the House of Commons does not matter?
No.
All you need is a shrewd leader who can be merchandised and good backroom boys.
That all counts, but the House of Commons also counts. And it counts especially if you're an opposition leader. If you're an opposition, let me put it this way, if you're a prime minister and you have an image problem, you can remake your cabinet, introduce new legislation, go on foreign trips. You can take all kinds of initiatives. If you're in opposition, and you've just had Bob Ray on here from the NDP, Parliament is your platform. You can travel around the country, but you don't get much media coverage when you do it, except when you come on the Jack Webster show. Parliament is your platform, and the way in which a party performs in Parliament is in some way a measure of how they'll be received in the country.
Question. How long will Trudeau last after the Constitution is back?
He wants to host the Economic Summit next summer. After that,
that's in Canada?
That's in Canada, in Ottawa next summer. After that, it's a mug's game, Jack. I haven't got a clue. He could be here until he's 2001.
How long till Joe gets dumped?
I heard your prediction election night. His challenge in February at the policy convention, at which time the delegates will be asked for a leadership review, I think he'll win it. But I think about 30%, give or take 5% of the delegates will vote for a leadership review. His next challenge, I think, will be the subsequent convention. If he hasn't shown by then that he can turn public opinion around, I think there'll be a serious dump Clark
Does
movement.
he have a natural successor?
Not at the moment.
Not anywhere in the party?
Well, you say a natural successor in the sense that people thought John Turner was a natural successor for Trudeau. No. See, all of the prospective Tory candidates at the moment, whether it's Crombie, Flora MacDonald, Crosby, Mulroney, and so on, all have very serious liabilities attached to them. But you know, if you had asked me in 1975 who'll be the next Conservative leader, or if you'd asked 100 of the media experts and pundits, or 100 people in the Conservative Party, you'd have been lucky if 5% had said Joe Clark. And if you did the same thing in 1967, when Pearson looked like he might step down and said who's going to lead the party, you wouldn't have got Trudeau.
Barbara Emile told me how she faked the poll.
What'd she do?
At the leadership convention. She imagined the polls. She was told to poll them. She couldn't poll them. They had electronic gimmicks, so she fiddled it. And she predicted Trudeau on the Sunday night on the CBC National News. Fabrication. It's in her book.
I only tell truths in my book.
Well, she tells about fabrications in her book. Politics on the phone with Simpson and Webster. Simpson and Webster. Webster and Simpson.
No, you got it right the first time.
Constitution, discipline of power. What have you? After the break. Jeffrey Simpson of Discipline of Power. This is your first book.
It's the first one.
Difficult to write, eh?
You got to grind it. It's tough.
Especially when you're doing your...
I really wanted to write that book because I had had an opportunity to see the Conservatives and the Liberals and watch politics the last couple of years, and I thought that there were some pretty serious things that had gone wrong, so I wanted to write it very much, and that helps.
All right, we asked you about Clark's natural successor, nil, at the moment. I challenge you to name a natural successor at the moment to Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
I defy the challenge, I'm sorry.
You mean you just can't do it?
I don't know. I mean, I look at the Liberal Party and I say, who conceivably is the heir apparent? I don't think there is anyone. I think the legacy of the Liberals over the last few years, after the last 5 or 6 years, has been that some of the would-be successors have gone. I will say this, that if the convention is early rather than late, I think Don MacDonald will run and be a very strong candidate.
Candidate for an aircraft company or something?
No, candidate for leader of the Liberal Party.
Didn't he go into big business again?
Oh, yes, but he was out here in British Columbia in the last campaign, campaigning for a lot of Liberals. He's got a lot of IOUs in the Liberal Party.
Turner's finished, done, gone.
If he wants to come back, he'd still be a very formidable opponent. I don't think he will come back.
Would you say formidable? Or I would say formidable.
I'm an Easterner.
The calls might be about the Constitution, they might be about you, they might be about anything, but you're prepared to take a chance on it.
I'm prepared, Jack, if you are.
Go ahead, please.
Morning, gentlemen.
Up a wee bit.
Morning, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The thing, Mr. Simpson, I don't like Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I don't like him at all. I think the man scares me in many ways. Is he as inscrutable and as enigmatic as he seems? And do you really believe, I believe that he couldn't possibly be corrupted by money because his daddy left him so much. But I think the man's corrupted and obsessed by power. I'll hang up the phone and listen to your answer.
Thank you. Excellent.
I don't think he's corrupted by power. I think he likes power a great deal, and I think the bottom line reason why he came back was he was given a chance to wield power, and that temptation was too attractive for him to resist. I will say, however, that Mr. Trudeau has had a fixation with the Constitution, which goes back many years. But if you look at the difference between what he has said on the Constitution and what he has done, there's a big difference. His rhetoric has always been much tougher, much harder than his actual actions. He's never, Jack, pushed any constitutional reform down anybody's throat.
They just muffed it.
He talks about it a lot.
What they've done now is entrench the Official Languages Act, or what they will do, and they muffed the mechanism for that act, didn't they?
I don't know if you mean the mechanism in terms of the administration
Well, they
of it?
botched it up, yes. They spent and wasted a lot of money and annoyed a lot of people with a lot of silly little things.
Maybe,
especially
but
people in the West.
I still think that act's essential for Canada.
Oh, so do I.
You won't get me backing off that one.
I won't back off it either, nor the entrenchment. But they blew their image on it out here, I'll tell you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, first I would just like to congratulate Mr. Simpson on showing that boys from Crawford House really can write, which you'll understand. My point relates directly back to Senator Perrault, and I think brings out the point of Mr. Trudeau's ramming the Constitution down our throats, as it was put earlier. We see, for those who watch the constitutional talks, we saw Rafe Mayer, with whom I don't necessarily agree on many things, make a very eloquent statement about BC's feelings. And Senator Perrault then turned around and then, as the next speaker, shot him down quite violently and stated that this was nonsense. And this whole dichotomy with Western Canada, seeing that they're being represented by non-elected people who are contradicting the elected representatives, really leaves a lot of people with the feeling that the Constitution is indeed being rammed down their throats.
Well, to the extent that the last two elections produced a result whereby one party is terribly weak in Quebec and the other party, the governing party, is terribly weak in Western Canada, you get situations such as the one you just mentioned, which are, I think, very dangerous and which serve to erode the legitimacy of the federal government in, for instance, the eyes of people like you who don't see that their views are being adequately represented.
But he's a different person. He learned the word dichotomy at Crawford House. What is Crawford House?
This gentleman used to go to the University of Toronto schools, obviously, and we had a house system.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, please. Yes.
Right now, according to we're overloaded right now as far as Ontario, Quebec is. If it comes to referendum for Canada, why can't we have a referendum each in each province separately and go by that?
Well, it might be. I don't think the federal government's yet indicated what kind of a referendum they have in mind, but it conceivably could be a referendum whereby it would be necessary to have, along the lines, say, of an amending formula, a majority of the votes in certain regions of the country, and the referendum would only pass if, in fact, it got a majority in the different regions, including, for instance, Western Canada. I don't know if that's what they have in mind. My guess is they'd go for a straight national referendum, but they could go for another kind.
It's got to be 80% of something, including Ontario and Quebec.
Well, that's the amending formula, but you could have a referendum that said in order for it to pass, you have to get a majority in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and Western Canada.
The 5 regions. Old W.A.C. Bennett
4 regions, I said.
Well, we have 5 regions. We make British Columbia separate.
Mr. Bennett's dropped that now, you know.
I'm talking about the old man.
Well, he's not the premier anymore.
W.A.C. Some people say more's a pity. Go ahead from Ladysmith.
Yes, Jack, I would like to know how can you have mobility of labor when you've got provincial education? When you get a welder to come out to BC from Nova Scotia with a welding ticket, and he comes out here at public expense from the government, and when he gets out here, he doesn't. His ticket isn't.
He can't use his ticket. You know, all these little things in mobility might well be challenged in the courts. Whether or not a welding ticket from Newfoundland, where they weld upside down, some people say, and British Columbia...
Don't say it there, Jack.
...would be interchangeable. The appeals to the courts, to a Supreme Court of Canada, frighten me a little bit, I'll tell you that. we're going to finish up with a U.S.-type constitution as sure as God made little apples.
I don't think so, Jack. I think you'll move a little bit in that direction.
But she makes a great point.
Well, I think the point that the caller is making is right in the sense that, as Bob Ray was suggesting, there's a legitimate division between your needs for a national market and for a national standards and provincial economies, and they sometimes are going to rub against each other very uneasily. It offends me as a Canadian, as it offends you, I think.
Mobility only works really for unskilled laborers.
No, not at all. If you're a lawyer, for instance, from Toronto, and there are lots of them who want to come out here to British Columbia...
You got to sit your exams again.
Exactly. Well, that's a form of indirect impediment.
I got to tell you a little... Thanks, Mal. I'll tell you a little story we did yesterday. Now, this may be against the interests of national unity, but you Easterners wouldn't care about this kind of thing. There was a guy in Cache Creek this summer who wanted a waitress. The job paid $4.50 an hour.
Oh.
Ashcroft and Kamloops couldn't supply him.
Right.
The job vacancy went on computer.
Yes.
The waitress was flown from Pasadena, near Cornerbrook, Newfoundland, to Cache Creek for the job at $4.50 an hour and lasted in the job 5 weeks. Last we found her, they deny she's on unemployment insurance now, but we think she's in Banff. And we hope they're not building up a new Banff UIC ski team. But that cost us $1,880.60.
That isn't a question of mobility rights, though. That's a question, surely, of the administration of manpower and unemployment insurance. You know, the mobility rights comes in talking in Newfoundland. Newfoundland's passed legislation that says if you're going to work on the oil rigs off Newfoundland, we're going to favor our own residents. Well, an awful lot of people, perhaps from Nova Scotia or from New Brunswick, where unemployment's very high, might like to go and work on those rigs.
Oh, Fort McMurray is full of good Newfies who are making good money, and so they should, because the labour is needed in Alberta.
One of the things I don't understand in the opposition to mobility rights from some of the small provinces is that if the big provinces started saying for their own reasons, I'm sorry, we're going to put in discriminatory policies against your people, they would be hurt much more than the small provinces.
Ontario and Quebec have been at that fight for a while, though, haven't they?
Over construction workers, that's right.
Joey's book, Discipline of Power. Newspaperman Jeffrey Simpson, Toronto Globe and Mail. Must for all political observers of current politics in Canada today.
You said it, Jack.
Your next one will probably be on the collapse of the new Constitution. I'll be back after the break. I wish that were our last broadcast in the Constitution.
It's only the start.
Right, Monday, next week.
The whole start of the civic election in Vancouver. Every mayoral candidate will be here.
And other stuff. And we have a special bulletin for the Ombudsman Monday morning on his lost file. We must do that off the top Monday morning. I wanted to do it this morning, but it would have upset the tenor.
Gossip within the Constitution is not nice.
Agreed. Monday, 9 a.m. precisely.